Good evening and a very, very warm welcome to my YouTube. My name's Chris, and this evening we're taking a look at Sir Francis Chichester and this 1967 photograph of the 53-foot Gypsy Moth IV brought Francis Chichester his greatest moment of worldwide exposure. He was rounding Cape Horn on his record-breaking solo round-the-world voyage. He had already been knighted after arriving at his only stop in Sydney. The Queen completed the ceremony on his arrival in Plymouth using appropriately the sword of the previous circumnavigator, Sir Francis Drake. The name of the yacht gives a pointer to Chichester's earlier achievements with aviation. Sir Francis Chichester was born at Sherwell, a rectory near Barnstaple in North Devon in 1901. Chichester had a tough childhood in Devon, and at age just 17 he managed to escape to New Zealand, determined to make his fortune. After a number of jobs as a miner, lumberjack, salesman, he finally grew a very successful business in real estate and forestry. As a side venture, he and a business partner set up a company offering pleasure flights to tourists. This triggered an interest in flying, and when Chichester returned to England in 1929, he joined Brooklands Flying Club to gain his pilot's licence, and he bought a Gypsy Moth, which he named Madame Elijah, and developed his skills in flights around England and Europe. Then, despite his relative inexperience, he announced his intention to fly to Australia. Only the famous Bert Hinkler had done this the previous year. Chichester left Croydon in December 1929, hoping to beat Hinkler's record, but a delay waiting for a replacement propeller to be sent to Libya ruined that plan. He arrived successfully in Sydney after 180 flying hours. The Tasman Sea lay ahead as an impossible task for a Moth, so it finished its journey to New Zealand by ship. The challenge of the Tasman Sea remained, and Chichester realised that he could reach Australia if he fitted the Moth with floats to alight on the sea and refuel at Norfolk Island and Lord Howe Island. The real problem now was to find these tiny spots in the sea. The only method of position fixing available was to take sunshots with a sextant, not easy in the cramped, vibrating cockpit, then laboriously work out the fix with a pencil and paper. He decided to use the principle of off-course navigation, i.e. deliberately aiming for a point to one side of the island. When this point was reached, there would be no doubt which way to make a 90-degree turn for the final leg to the island. To reduce potential errors in calculation, Chichester worked out a series of examples based on his estimate of the sun's position at the time of his expected arrival at a critical point on his course. However well prepared Chichester was, the flight was not easy. At one point his course was blocked by the low cloud of a rainstorm, needing a diversion. Round the storm we flew, into calmer air under a weak, lazy sun. I took out the sextant and got 2 shots. It took me 30 minutes to work them out, for the engine kept backfiring and my attention wandered every time it did. But the navigation system worked successfully, and the Moth became the first aircraft to visit both Norfolk Island and Lord Howe Island. There was no harbour at Lord Howe Island, so the Moth was anchored for the night close to the beach overnight, and then the wind changed. The next morning Chichester looked out to see his Moth overturned in the water. He thought it was all over and was resigned to giving up. The damage to the upper wing seemed irreparable, and the tiny island, population of only 150, offered few facilities. But the eager islanders thought otherwise. They dismantled the Moth, hauled it to shore, and stripped the engine. A list of spares was sent to Haviland in England, and in 10 weeks the repaired Moth was relaunched. Chichester flew on across the Tasman Sea, experienced storms, dodging waterspouts, and nursing a troubled engine to complete the first aerial crossing of the Tasman Sea. Now he was in Australia, he connected with his flight from England, so why not carry on and fly around the world? A route was planned north through the Philippines and China and in Japan. On taking off from a harbour, the background of the hills disguised a line of overhead telephone wires, and the Moth flew directly into them. This catapulted the seaplane back down onto the harbour wall. Chichester's injuries included 13 broken bones, and he was not fully recovered for 5 years. By then it was 1936 and the Wanderlust returned, so he bought a puss moth and flew it throughout Asia and Europe and back to England. When World War II broke out, he was 38 years old, but he applied 3 times to join the RAF, and each time he was rejected for nearsightedness. Grounded, he became a chief navigation instructor at the RAF Central Flying School and wrote many of the manuals for pilots and navigators. After the war, he started a map-selling business, which survived until 2012, and in the meantime he'd taken up sailing. In 1960, a half-crown bet, that's 2 shillings and sixpence, or in today's money 12.5 pence, encouraged him to join a single-handed race across the Atlantic. He won by a margin of an astonishing 16 days. Further Atlantic crossings raised his sights to a round-the-world voyage. This was to bring him fame, and at 65 years of age, his greatest moment of fame was a knighthood. I feel I need to say few characterise the daring spirit that has marked the history of yachting better than Sir Francis Chichester, whose single-handed round-the-world voyage in 1966-1967 charted the course for subsequent generations of yachtsmen and yachtswomen. His navigational instruments included a sextant and a Rolex Oyster perpetual chronometer. It was Plymouth in Devon. On the 28th of May 1967, Francis Chichester arrived in Plymouth on Gypsy Moth IV after completing a solo circumnavigation of the globe from west to east. Fair winds, southwest sea, calm. The conditions were ideal for the crowd that swelled on the waterfront of the English town that evening, as well as for the exceptional sailor who took centre stage. It was a historic moment. 250,000 people had gathered around the port to cheer home one of the lords of the sea. Out in Plymouth Sound, some 300 boats with horns, sirens, blaring away, paid their homage. All eyes were riveted on the lean English gentleman at work, calm and unhurried on the deck of a white yacht, with peeling paintwork, 16 metres of mahogany, returning from the high seas, its 2 masts standing proudly amid stitched, scarred sails. With a tug of the wheel to starboard, the ketch veered into wind. As his round-the-world odyssey came to an end, the frail silhouette slowly lowered each of the 4 sails one by one, as if furling the colours of a mast. The voyage was over. As he sailed into his home port on the 28th of May 1967, Sir Francis Chichester became the first person to complete a solo circumnavigation of the globe from west to east, having made only a single stopover, a total of more than 29,617 nautical miles, and 226 days at sea. At the time, he was the fastest man to conquer this. This was the Everest of the sea. Rounding the treacherous Cape Horn, he had been buffeted by 120-mile-an-hour winds and battled 50-foot waves, and his fundamental navigational tools just included charts, a sextant, and a Rolex Oyster watch. A fact that is much, much more surprising is that the man who had just pulverised the record was 65 years old. His solo adventure would have exhausted a man half his age. Furthermore, Francis Chichester had only learned to sail less than a decade earlier. Sir Francis was a self-made man who had tried his hand at almost everything: estate agent, then aviator, lumberjack, then sailor, and then a director of a cartography company before he set out to sea. And 8 years beforehand, he'd already vanquished a long illness that came close to killing him. And then an irresistible urge, an insatiable appetite for adventure, as strong as the southern ocean wind, had driven him to attempt a single-handed voyage round the world. A few weeks after his return, the Queen completed the knighting of Sir Francis Chichester for his exploit, with the very sword that had been used to knight the privateer Francis Drake some 4 centuries earlier. Hope you've enjoyed that short film and that rather a brief look at the greatest sailor of his generation. Sir Francis Chichester was a hero of another era, an age when sophisticated electronics had yet to make their way aboard sailing vessels. GPS and satellite telephones had yet to be invented. Navigation depended essentially on a sextant and a watch, and a precise, reliable and robust time-measuring instrument was vital for his successful voyage. With such a tool, Chichester would effectively have been sailing blind. Without such a tool, Chichester would effectively have been sailing blind and had been unable to determine his exact position. Thank you, Sir Francis Chichester. You were certainly a hero of the day, and I very, very much remember your journey home back in 1967 when I was but a young teenager. Thank you very much. I really hope you've all enjoyed this short film, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. All the very best. Take care. Cheers for now.